If you have a Bible with you this evening, I will invite you to open to Job chapter 1, chapter 2, and just stay focused around the book of Job. What we've been doing on Sunday nights is looking at some important questions that are asked in the Bible. Of course, we can't look at all the questions that are asked in the Bible. We'll just look at a few and get a sampling of them. And as we do that, it puts us in different places in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and we cover a lot of territory that way. But while we're looking at those questions and we think about things that are surrounding them, we're going to run across some things that we'll discover that will matter to us today. Lessons that it will teach us, principles that it will give to us for life, that will be good for us and encourage us in the right way. So we're doing that tonight in the book of Job. And the book of Job, 42 chapters long. It's a fairly lengthy book as far as books of the Bible go. It's packed with questions. There's all kinds of questions in the book of Job. I think I opened to chapter 38, only 42 chapters. I opened to chapter 38, and that's where there's a dialogue that begins between God and the patriarch Job. And just from chapter 38, 39, 40 into 41, I think I counted 65 some questions just in that section of the book of Job. So there are tons of them in there. And we're going to try to bring our thoughts to center on one particular question. And that's in Job chapter 2 and verse 9. Job's wife is never mentioned by name, so I'll refer to her as Mrs. Job. I don't know what else to call her other than Job's wife or Mrs. Job. So Mrs. Job is only mentioned 3 times in the book. And she only speaks one line. If I were going to be in a play in school, I'd love that part, a one-liner. That's about all I could remember. So she speaks one time in the whole biblical record. All in the book of Job or anywhere else, she has one line to speak, and this is it. Chapter 2, verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." How'd you like that recorded about you for all eternity? That's how she makes her way into the holy book we call the Bible, with that one line. And it's a horrible line. It's a horrible suggestion. She only says that one thing anywhere, and that's what's recorded about her. You know, when you're under pressure in life, sometimes you think and you say the worst things. And you wish you could take it back. I wish I wouldn't have said that. I should have said this instead. I shouldn't have thought that. I should have thought this. And you think about how you'd like to take that back. And most of the time, we can go back and tell somebody, "I'm sorry I said that. I shouldn't have said that. Please forgive me." But here's Mrs. Job, and it's recorded in the Bible. And there it is forever and ever and ever. And it's a line that I'm sure she would rather not have spoken. And in the end of it all, as it all came out at the end of the book, if she could have taken that back, I know she would have. It was a bad question. And she suggests an answer with it that's even worse. Curse God and die. Well, now there's a reason for all of that. There's something going on around it, and that's what our investigation is tonight. Let's understand the question. Let's understand why she says it. Let's not make an excuse for it. Let's not try to make it the right thing, but let's at least understand what's going on there, and then we can learn under the stress of life that maybe we ought to stop and, what do they say, count to 10 or something like that before you say anything, and think about what we're going to say. What's going on in our mind, in our emotion? And let's think that through before we speak, because somebody's going to record that if they hear it. They're going to remember it, and we want to leave a good impression. I'd like to go on to some things about Job himself, the man. There are some things that we readily know about him. If you're familiar with the Bible at all, if you've ever read the book of Job, most of the time we spend our time in Job as sort of a Job sandwich. We spend our time in the first 2 chapters, And then we go to the end, chapter 38 through 42. And all the stuff in the middle we kind of gloss over because it's so long. And it's sort of repetitive. And I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But we spent a lot of time in those first two chapters. Consequently, there's a lot of things we know about Job off the top of our head. We start out in Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were also 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And if you would ever question that and say, well, in that day and time, was that a lot? Was he rich? Did he have a lot? Well, the answer's in the rest of that verse. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. He was extremely wealthy, having 11,000 animals and servants to take care of them. He was extremely wealthy. He was the greatest of the men of the East. So we remember about him that he was from the land of Uz. Well, where's Uz? I don't know. Can't pinpoint it. We don't know exactly where it was, but he was the greatest of the men in the East, so it's somewhere in what they would reference as the East, but there's not really a way to pinpoint that and say it's at this longitude and latitude. You can't do it that way. We don't know for sure. And anything you see on a map that somebody puts in the back of your Bible or something would be a guess. But we know he's from the land of Uz. We remember the description of his faith toward God. Blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. King James Bible says, eschewing evil. He turned away from it. Evil's there, I'm going that way. He didn't want any part of it. That's the kind of man he was. That's the kind of faith that he had. The man who lived in the land of Uz. He had a large family, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He and his wife were really blessed. Sometimes you see someone with a large family today, and you might just hold your head and shake it and go, oh man. Gwen and I will remember a family we saw in Saginaw, Michigan. When they attended church, they would come in and they had 18 children. And they were so organized. Those children would walk in from the oldest to the youngest, from the highest to the shortest. And they would fill their pew. And they were so organized, had it so together, it was a marvel to watch. And, you know, we would look at that with our 3 kids and we'd go, how are they doing that? But the answer is they're blessed. And Job was a very blessed man with those 10 children. So we remember that about his family. And with that large family, he had great spiritual care for them. He was a true patriarch spiritually of the family. He would make sacrifices and offer for his family on the chance that maybe they had sinned in some way. And he would care for them like that and teach them in that way. He had great wealth. He had great standing in the East. Chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. I wonder if that's why he had 7 sons. 7 days in the week, they would each have a feast on their day. And they would invite their sisters to come and to eat and drink with them. When the days of their feasting had completed their cycle, son 1, 2, 3, 4, get to the 7th one, end of the week, when they had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. If you're in a home like that, you're really blessed. If you have a father like that, you're really blessed, who will keep you on track with God, who will call you into prayer with Him, who will remind you of who you need to be a godly man or a godly woman as you grow up. That was really a blessed home to be that way. We also remember that the book opens with a scene in heaven, a scene that Job He never has an inkling about it. He's never told about it. Didn't know that it happened. As far as we're told, he never found out. But Satan is accusing God. And he's accusing God and using Job to do it. So here we have Job chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands and his possessions and have increased in the land. And you put forth your hand now and you touch all that he has, he'll surely curse you to your face." Well, of course, God, Satan is saying, in the heavenly realm, curtain pulled back for us to have insight into that. Of course he's faithful to you. Of course he's a man of integrity in his faith. You're paying him to be faithful. You've given him 7 sons, 3 daughters, 11,000 animals, all these servants. Everything's great in his life. You put a hedge about him that way. Nothing can touch him. Because you're blessing him so richly, of course he's faithful. You are his paycheck. So Satan is suggesting something very evil here. And that's the dialogue in the heavenly realm that's going on. And Job never finds out about it. And so God tells Satan, it's not true. That's not why he has faith in God. That's not why he worships God. So go ahead, Satan, he's in your hand. But you can't take his life. And in a day, as you read through chapter 1, all of his children die at the same moment. His servants are killed on that day. All of his animals are gone on that day. He is broke. He is childless. But let's remember this. There's Mrs. Job. She is also broke. She is also childless. And I would venture to say, as hard as that would hit a man, it would hit his wife even harder. And so she's struggling right alongside him. And in Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground. And can you believe it? He worshiped God. Satan did not expect that. He told God, if you'll take away all this stuff, he'll curse you to your face. But instead, he bows down and he worships God. Is he in sorrow? Absolutely. He's tearing his garments in grief and sorrow. And he falls down to the ground and he worships God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord's taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So now Satan comes back and he's going to up the ante. He's going to come back at God and make another accusation. Chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. Okay, he was fine through all of that. But skin for skin, you touch his body and then see what happens. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. And sometimes you've heard people say, well, if you have your health, you have everything. That's so untrue. Health is a lot. Health means a lot, doesn't it? On days when you feel horrible, when you're sick, when you're injured, when you're trying to recover, and you long for those days, you think of those days when you wake up and you don't hurt. Won't that be a great day? Health means a lot to us, but health doesn't mean everything. So that's the accusation that Satan is making now. So you get down to verse 5. However, put forth your hand now, touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. And so Satan is allowed to attack his physical well-being. And This is where we find the question and the statement of Mrs. Job that forms our lesson question tonight. Job is sitting outside of the normal area on an ash heap, and he is scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery, and his body is covered with sore boils. And he's scraping them with a shard on an ash heap, trying to find some relief and to be away from people. His existence has turned into nothing but misery. And it would be just as hard for his wife. She's lost her children. She's broke. She has nothing. Now her husband appears to be waiting to pass away. It's attacking him that violently. And so now she's without her husband, and she's watching him go through misery on top of everything else. And it would have been hard for her too. Now there are some things, as you have to peruse your way through the book of Job, all 42 chapters, you have to look through the book of Job to find all this other information. It's not right up in front in the first 2 chapters. Some of it is, but not all of it is. There are things that we discover as we read through the rest of that material that maybe we've forgotten. And you begin reading through that book, and you'll remember this. It is a series of dialogues. He has 3 friends who come to him to console him and to comfort him. And they end up accusing him. They come to comfort, but they end up pointing a finger at him. And it's a series of dialogues. And there's 3 series of those that take place. The first friend speaks, Job answers him. Next friend speaks, Job answers him. Next friend speaks, Job answers him. Round 2. And it starts all over again. And you go through 3 sessions like that. And then at the end, there is a younger man, a 4th man who's there by the name of Elihu. And when you get to chapter 32 through 37, this 4th younger man begins to speak. And he takes his turn talking to Job and telling him what's what. And we'll better understand what's going on with Mrs. Job when we understand all that dialogue, all that accusation that's coming against him, that surely, Job, because you've sinned in some way, God's punishing you and trying to shake you into repentance. So why don't you just do it? And Job says, I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything. And he goes on to defend himself to his friends over and over. And his wife is there, and she's watching all of this. But some of the other things you might forget are about the illness as it's described in the book. Here's how bad it is. Chapter 2, verse 7, he has boils. We've already talked about that. Chapter 2, verse 8, he has itching. Chapter 2, verse 12, as his friends approach him, they get to a distance where they see the man sitting on the ash heap. They can't recognize him. He is so disfigured and so changed, they can't even tell it's Job. And they're his friends. And they've come from afar to help him and to encourage him, end up accusing him, but when they draw near, they can't even recognize him because of the disfigurement of the illness. Chapter 3, verse 24, he's lost his appetite. Moving on to chapter 3, verse 25, he's filled with depression. Chapter 7, verse 5, he has worms and running sores. Chapter 9, verse 18, talks about him having difficulty breathing. Or maybe the intent of that particular verse is that God won't even let me catch a breath in all of this. It's just one thing continuously after the other. Chapter 16, verse 16, there appears to be darkening around his eyes. Chapter 19, verse 17, his breath is a stench. His wife can't stand to get close to him because of the illness and what it's doing to his breath. Children, as they see him, despise him because of the way that he looks. Verse 18. Chapter 19, verse 20, he's lost weight. Chapter 30, verse 17, he has aching bones and aching body. It has gone into the core of his being. He hurts inside, outside, everywhere. Chapter 30 and verse 30, he has blackened skin and is running a fever. If you look from chapter into chapter 29, verse 2, it appears that all of this has gone on for months. This is long. This isn't a week and a half and you're over it like a cold. This is something that has gone on for months and seems to be terminal in the way that it's looking. So here's Mrs. Job. She suffered everything Job suffered, but now she's the one who has to sit there and watch him go through all of this torment. And she can't even draw close to her husband anymore. Imagine sitting there in someone who is the dearest to you and having to look at all of that and see it happening and see the misery. We want answers in situations like that. What is this? What's going on? Is there hope? Is there help? What's the remedy? We say our prayers over and over and over again, and we want healing. We want it to be fixed. We want it to be over. We want it to be back to the way that it was. And sometimes it gets so bad that death seems better than life. But it matters even how we do that. All of that matters because there's more to it than that. So we get down to Mrs. Job's question and her misunderstanding. Job 2 verse 9 again. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Job's integrity is described in the beginning of the book. He's blameless, he is upright, he fears God, and he turns away from evil. That is his integrity. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Are you still going to maintain that? In other words, what is it worth? What good is it doing you to hold to your integrity? And you see his integrity in the first chapter when his children die, and he bows down and worships God. And after his health suffers, in chapter 2, verse 10, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips, even after his health suffered. And what she's suggesting is, let go of your innocence before God. Let go of your desire to please God. Stop trying to please God. Curse God and die. Is she suggesting euthanasia? Is she suggesting suicide? She certainly seems to be suggesting to turn your back on God and forget about that. To curse God is exactly what Satan said he'd do. Both times in chapter 1 and chapter 2, as Satan's confronting God, if you do this, he'll curse you to your face. If you do this, he'll curse you to your face. That's exactly what Satan was after, and she's playing right into it. She is playing out the hand of Satan. Curse God and die. Exactly what the devil wanted. But Job's not ready to do that. He was concerned with his sons, that maybe in their feasting they had sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And he would offer sacrifice for them and consecrate them, bring them back into their right relationship with God again. Now his wife says, "You curse God and die." Are you still going to hold to your faith, to your integrity? Just give it all up and turn your back on God. To curse God and die is supposing something that's not true. The idea she seems to have is that you can cut ties with God in this life. Just close your Bible, put it away on a shelf, and never look at it again. Never darken the door of the building where God's people gather to worship Him. Don't pay any attention to that. You just turn your back on God. Cut your ties with God in this life, and you won't have to face Him in the next. That's her misunderstanding. That He can do that in this life and be done with God. But that is not at all the way that it works. You can decide whatever you want to decide about God in this life, but you will face Him in the next. And she was not considering that. Later in the book of Job, Job chapter 14, there's a popular passage there. It goes from verse 10 through verse 14. I'm not going to read it all for time's sake, but it is a passage that comes up frequently at a funeral. And part of that text is this in verse 14. If a man dies, will he live again? This is Job. Job is saying that. These are the words of Job. He seems to be questioning that. If a man dies, will he live again? Is there anything beyond the grave? Well, there is. And his wife is thinking that there is not. We do not just die and disappear. Mrs. Job was under the impression that when you die, you will have peace. That's not necessarily true. The undertaker can put whatever expression on your face you want. And it can appear that you're at peace when people look at you. But that's a facade. That may not be true at all. If we curse God in this life and die without God in this life, even though our bodies were in physical pain and suffering, that does not mean that we have all of a sudden come to a place of peace. If we have died without God, the torment is only beginning. Only by holding to our integrity when we pass in this life is it referred to in the New Testament as asleep with Jesus. Peace when we die. But those who are not in peace with God in life will not be in peace with God in death and will face Him again. So she was under a wrong impression that you can be done with all this misery if you'll just curse God and die. But if that's the way he goes out, it won't end his misery. In a sense, and I want you to be very careful how you hear me right now. In a sense, all paths in life lead to God, but not necessarily to His favor. And what I mean by that is, you will open your eyes beyond the grave and you will stand before God in the judgment. Whatever path you take in this life, you will open your eyes beyond the grave and you will be standing before God in judgment. All paths lead to God, but not necessarily to His favor. There's only one path that leads to His favor, and that's in Christ His Son. And that is the way of truth that is taught in the Bible. That's the only path that leads to His favor. So that when we lift our eyes for the first time on the other side, we are in the good grace of God and finding peace and rest that He promises the faithful. How we endure this life determines which side of God we'll be on in eternity. Now, I want to give you a few lesson takeaways, and we have about 3 major things to talk about here. I'll do them rather quickly, and the sermon will be over. And you'll be ready to make a decision. So takeaway number 1 is that we notice Job was a prime target of Satan. Isn't that interesting? That God said to Satan, "Where have you been?" And he answered God and said, "I've been walking to and fro on the earth." And God said, "Have you seen my servant Job?" And Satan surely had. He saw Job. And God described the great faith of this man, and that's where Satan said, "He's that way because you're buying him off." But if you take it away, He'll curse you to your face. So Job was a prime target of Satan because of Job's rich relationship to God, because of his great faith toward God. Like Peter in the New Testament, Satan wanted to sift him like wheat. And he proposed to do exactly that. Here's the question, takeaway. Is your faith of such a kind that Satan would even notice you? Is your faith in God of the caliber that Satan would take notice of it and make it a challenge? Or is it so weak that he would assume he's already got you? What kind of faith do you have? And God loved Job, and God was counting on Job. And when we let God down in difficult times of life, we forget that God is always worthy of our worship. Has nothing to do with the convenience of life. One of Satan's arguments stems from that. And the argument would basically be summarized this way. Satan is saying to God, every man has his price. Every man can be bought. And if the price tag gets too high for him, he'll curse you to your face. A Christian who has a what's in it for me attitude would have crumbled at the first test. It's got to be more than that. Faith needs to be more than that. It needs to be built on the nature of God, the worthiness of God, not the convenience and ease of life. It can't be that. Number 3, it's about the lack of spiritual character and fortitude of Job's wife. Her faith was not the same kind as his. Her faith did not match her husband's faith. God designed marriage, among other things, to be an encouragement to the soul. A husband helps his wife to get to heaven. A wife helps her husband to get to heaven. Never would one say to the other, do you still hold to your integrity, curse God and die? Her faith was not of the same kind. According to his wife, there was a point at which God is no longer worthy of worship. And that is never true. It is important to remember that when we look for a mate, we should be people of spiritual maturity, looking for someone of spiritual maturity. Because the hard days will come, and we will be tested. And a husband and wife will need to lean on each other to get through that faithfully. I'd like to leave you with James chapter 5 and verse 11. New Testament passage looking backward into the book of Job, which may be a record of some of the earliest days recorded in the Bible. And here is a text in James 5 and verse 11. We count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and merciful. You can choose faithfulness. If you've forgotten that, if you've chosen less, you can return to faithfulness again. We just need a reminder that God is worthy of our worship, and no matter how difficult life gets, God is worthy of that. And we should fall down before Him and worship Him always. That is a major message in the book of Job, and I hope that it resonates with us today. We offer the invitation to encourage each one in the faith. Most of us here have obeyed the gospel of Christ. We've heard the gospel message. We understand how it is involved around the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and how the Bible teaches that we obey that gospel in water baptism. It involves confessing the name of Christ as the Son of God, repenting of sins, being done with all of that, and being immersed in the waters of baptism, whereby we are buried by baptism into the death of Christ. In His death is where He shed His blood. And we contact that blood when we are buried by baptism into His death. And we rise from baptism to walk in newness of life. Most of us here have understood that and obeyed that, but not all. Think about it. Consider it. If you have questions about it, if you need to study about it, would you please tell me after service? Let's work our way through Bible study until your questions are answered about it. But if you know it, obey it. God is worthy. If you've obeyed the gospel already, but life has gotten hard and temptation has come your way and you've chosen the wrong course, return in repentance and begin again the faithful walk. It's to those things that the invitation calls you. It's the invitation of the Lord, not my personal invitation, not an invitation that comes from this congregation. It comes from heaven's throne. And it's a way that He made possible by sending His Son to this earth to die on our behalf. If we can help you this evening, we invite you to come to the front of this half auditorium as we stand and sing.